Hi, I'm Sally Treanor. Welcome. We're going to be doing some exercises in watercolor today on wet paper. This exercise is called the Lonesome Tree, and the palette is just two colors this time, two pigments. One is burnt sienna and the other one is French ultramarine blue, which is a granulating pigment, and I'll explain more about that as we go forward. This is a great exercise, and so let's paint. So the Lonesome Tree has a bunch of different elements, but let me just talk to you about some of the equipment. First of all, one of the things we're going to be doing is removing paint, and we need tools to do that. But if you don't have specialized tools, a credit card will be just fine. I use a credit card sometimes, but mostly I use my palette knives. These are clean palette knives that have never been used for anything but watercolor, and so they don't have any residual oil on them. And it's very nice, flexible. Both of them, all three of them actually are very flexible. This one less so, but these two are very flexible, and that's important. And those are the tools that we're going to be using besides our brushes. The other thing we're going to be using is a natural sponge. It's important that you use a natural sponge for this. It's much more forgiving to the paper, and it's very gentle, and it allows you to wet gently and remove water gently. And let's do that right now. First of all, because this is a wet exercise, that means we're working on wet paper, we have to wet the paper. To do that, I have put my sponge into my water bucket, and very gently, I'm going to take that sponge and rub across the surface of the paper on both sides. And I do it a couple of times, but very gently. We don't want to remove the sizing that's in the paper because that makes the paint penetrate the paper more than we want it to. Okay, so I've done this with a fairly sopping wet sponge at this point, but now I'm gonna go back into my bucket and squeeze the water out of the sponge. So it is now what I would call a thirsty sponge. That means it has no excess water in it. It's not gonna drip at all. And I'm gonna come back into this piece, and I'm going to be very careful to remove any standing water that is either on my work surface or on my paper. I'm also going to keep this sponge handy for while I'm working because I'm going to need it sometimes. There's lots of light shining on this paper in this studio right now. It's very dry in here, and that means the paper surface is going to dry very rapidly. And I want to always be able to control the amount of water that I have going on. So the Lonesome Tree. This is a little landscape. I'm working on a 16th of a sheet of paper, and I'm going to build on puddles I've already got going here because they only have the two pigments that I'm using. So let me reiterate, I'm using burnt sienna, and you can see as I add that to my puddle, and I want a pretty big puddle because I'm going to be using this for a while. So there's my burnt sienna, and the other color is French ultramarine blue. And you can see as I add that to that puddle, I'm changing the puddle from warm to cool. When it has more brown in the mixture, it's pretty warm. When it has more blue in the mixture, it's kind of blue. When I have a nice balance, it's a neutral gray. And that's one of the pleasures of this particular palette. I just love it because I can get that range of grays from warm to cool, and I can decide what my dominance is going to be. But at the same time, I can keep moving it in one direction or another. Okay, so we've got a pretty big puddle. I think I'll keep adding to it a little bit because it will help us as we go along to have more available to us. I'm just going to dip up a little water, but not shake out my brush in any way. I don't want to get rid of the pigment that I've already got in my brush. That's important. One of the things you need to learn to control is how much pigment and water you have in your brush at any one time. And so learn when not to wash out your brush when you're mixing new color. So let's just take our little painting, and I always start from the farthest far in the landscape, and that is the sky, always. I also like to put a little bit of dynamic stroking in, so I have something going on in the sky that's kind of interesting. The next plane, as it comes near us, is the middle distance. And in this case, let's go ahead and put some gentle hills back there. And let us put them in such a manner that when I stroke them in, they meet the wet sky and bleed into the sky. And that gives us a very interesting piece of texture there at the top of the hill, and not so much over here because this is dry. So one of the rules is, well, not dry, it's damp, and it's not gonna spread very far. One of the rules is when you touch an old puddle that's still wet with new pigment, the new pigment will push the pigment that's there out of the way, and sometimes it'll give you these lovely little blossoms or little tops of a hill tree line that are quite nice. Let's add to this. Let's now come to the nearest near. And as we come forward, we not only get darker, we get thicker paint. Let's just give ourselves a kind of shoreline back here in front of the mountain, and it's going to bring us down, and we're going to have a little lake here, and we're going to have some nice terrain in the front. And one of the things that's starting to happen, and perhaps you can see it, the blue, which I've said before is a granulating color, means that it never goes into complete solution. So you always have little bits of pigment, in this case, it's lapis lazuli ground up very fine, and it'll just start to settle out because it remains heavy. I can keep adding things. I'm just going to add another brush. I'm going to increase the pigment in my puddle once again. And now I can come into the sky and add a little drama up there. And I'm just barely touching the sky. I don't want to move the pigment around that's there. I want it to bleed nicely. I want it to do beautiful, interesting things. And you say, where's the tree? Well, that's what we're going to be getting to. You have to work pretty rapidly with this particular exercise because you don't want to have to work against dry paper. But you also have to wait until it's dry enough that you can move pigment around. Pigment still has to be damp, and create the tree. So I'm going to start with the credit card. Actually, it's my AAA card, but it's an expired one. And I'm going to produce the tree for you. And what I'm actually going to do is move pigment around. And there are different ways of doing it. And one of the important things is how you express the card against the paper. You can use the tip of one corner, or you can do a whole edge. That's pretty thick. Or you can bend it so just a portion of that card is opposing the paper. So let's do that. I'm going to, part of my tree is coming up. One of the things that you need to know about moving pigment around is that you always end a stroke at the narrow end of it. So here we're trying to establish root, and so I'm ending the stroke to get those pointy roots that make them look more natural. Reverse to come up again. Actually, moving the pigment around, it's still wet enough that I can do that, but it's not so wet that it doesn't run right back in. The less of the card that I oppose to the paper, the more narrow the stroke. And that makes kind of interesting details sometimes if you vary those things. We've got our lonesome tree acting proud and tall. And let's give ourselves a couple of rocks down here in the foreground. And it's how you scrape it, how much of the card you oppose to the paper. And we can even use the card to give ourselves some grasses. When you're doing the grasses, make sure that they kind of cross each other and don't all copy themselves and be the same height. You want them to be as natural as possible. You can go over the rocks that are already there and give yourself more detail. And there's lots of things you can keep doing to the tree to make it more and more interesting. But in truth, this is the most I want to do to this tree right now, and we need to let it dry until we go into it again. All right, so we've dried the paper. It's necessary to do that because otherwise we'll disturb all this nice line work and the interesting things that have happened here. And now that we've done that, I'm going to switch to a smaller brush and I'm going to warm up this puddle by adding more brown to it. And then I'm going to work out my brush a little bit so it's mostly brown. And now I'm giving myself the permission to use more water because we don't have such critical stuff happening. But look what happens as I liven up the tree with a little of that brown. It really changes the painting a lot. Still a lonesome tree, but now it has a little life to it. And that is, I'm gonna liven it up even more with something a little brighter, and you can see how much that changes that tree. Now it doesn't quite look so dead. This is obviously a late fall scene. We don't have any leaves on the tree anymore, but we might have a few leaves that are still kind of there. So one of the things I like to do with my palette knife is, instead of removing paint with the palette knife, now I'm going to pick up paint with the palette knife and add some interesting little branches and actually apply the paint with the palette knife. I'm just using the tip and I'm coming in with some little branchlets that would be there. They would be apparent. And the interesting thing about doing this with the palette knife is that it gives you spontaneous little strokes that you almost can't get with a brush. So also, I think I want to show that there's a few leaves left from its heyday in the fall when it had all those lovely leaves. So now let's go to a rigger, which is a brush, comes to a fine point, has long, skinny hairs. And I'm going to do just some very, very abstract little shapes that are kind of leaf-like. And they might be floating in the air. And we're just giving those last little touches that kind of finish the painting. We don't want to overdo it. We don't want to make it polka dotty. We just want to suggest some of that stuff. Also, I think I'm gonna lend a little more reality to our rocks, separate them a bit. And I like to use just the pure colors that I'm using, my two pigments, and drop into those rocks some of the blue, let it run into the red that I just put there. And I also want to come up here into the tree and enhance some of the shadows that are in the crooks of the tree with some of that blue. And that's pretty much it for this exercise. What it's given us is the opportunity to learn about how pigments work, how granulating color works to enhance the image of something, how to control the amount of water in our brush, how to control the amount of pigment in our brush. And it sets us up for all kinds of future things that will be interesting. So this is part of our bag of tricks, and that's the Lonesome Tree, folks. Thank you.